In the quiet suburbs, the streets whisper of ordinary life, and houses sit as if at peace under the amber glow of the streetlights. Their manicured lawns hide a much darker story than their pristine exterior. As a young man in his 20s, Elliot often walked these streets. For neighbors, he was an extraordinary person, another face behind the scenes. Inside, he had a storm of longing and regret bound up in the house across the street. Inside his house lived a young woman named Clara, who was once his anchor. Their friendship began innocently in 2019. Clara has a way of making others feel seen, and for the unemployed and confused Elliot, her passions are her lifeline and bond with her kitties. Their antics were a momentary distraction that he didn't dare voice. But as time passed, Clara's kindness was a double-edged sword. Her sudden check-in, "Are you okay?" felt like warmth to her. But for Elliot, they burned with unspoken hope. That's when he realized that she didn't share his feelings. The pain broke through. He turned around, hoping that time and distance would extinguish the flames of passion. Her mother reassured her, but there was an edge to her voice. That night, Lila couldn't shake the feeling of being stared at. Even though she's curled up under the covers, a week later, Lila is no longer afraid of being alone. Her mother saw it too when she dropped the towel in the bathroom. A dark figure walked across the glass. Its appearance was too clear to be human, but it's too hard for light to do. The soft cries sounded again, pulling their consciousness until they lost consciousness. The turning point came one stormy night when Lila and her mother heard scratching noises. It came from a vase, metal, deliberate, like something with claws trying to escape. And he did. A skeletal figure emerged from the gutter. Its limbs were incredibly long and thin. Its face was a mask of sagging skin and red eyes that glowed like coals in the darkness. Before Lila screamed, it rushed in. Across the street, Elliot sat at the window, gazing at Clara's house. The light from her bedroom was his only solace. It took him weeks to delete all contact with her and remove her from his life, but something pulled him back. Then he saw it. There were 2 doors in the living room window. He is a strangely patient man. He looked up at the sky. His eyes were blank. Elliot's stomach tightened. He noticed a woman who used to live there. She is a quiet person and had always held the book nearby. Her face was filled with worry, but now something about that house felt wrong. Lila started calling it Shadow Crawler, the name coming to her in a whisper. It was as if the creature had spoken directly to her. Her house felt closing up no matter where. Lila is yelling for his limbs, but he can't hear her. Limbs twisted abnormally to the point of getting into nooks and crannies. Her once loving father now seems distant, his eyes avoiding her, his movements stiff and mechanical. Lila wanted to believe he was just tired, but inside she knows the truth. Her father is not her father. One night, Elliot can't sleep and goes outside. Lila opens her window ajar, went very steadily to the ground, and she walks to her father. His feet carried him to the edge of Clara's house, then walked past until he was standing near Layla's house. The house feels alive. Its windows looked at him like eyes. Suddenly, a light flashed in the bathroom window, and Elliot saw her for a moment, Clara. There she stood. But there's something wrong. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes, they weren't hers. They glowed red like animals. As Elliot pieces together the fragments of his obsessions and strange events, his eyes find the neighborhood car. The terrifying realization dawned that the creature had accidentally not noticed and was searching for a broken heart, broken family, and unresolved grief. Shadow Crawler devours despair. It captures its prey until it becomes a hollow shell. Clara, who has always been kind and open, becomes his latest host. and now it's moving forward. Elliot heard another soft scream, this time coming from behind. He turned slowly and saw it. A shadow crawling out of the shadows like a writhing spider. His eyes were fixed on it, and he realized that it was his turn. But Elliot isn't powerless. He gripped the key tightly and charged at the creature, hoping to fight back. The last thing he saw was a faint smile on Clara's face before the darkness swallows you. Within a few days, the neighborhood was eerily calm again. Lila watches from the window as Elliot's house is empty. Now, her father had reassured her himself that the worst had passed, but late at night, when the house was quiet, Lila swore she heard soft scratching from the drain pipe.
The city shimmers under the starry sky. Its lights glittered like shattered glass across the horizon. Among these shining gems, the windows sparkled with promises of wealth and happiness. A building standing tall on a hill is a place of mystery. It is a maze where the lines between grace and danger are blurred. Miranda stood at the foot of the grand staircase. Accept her invitation. The edge of the stairs looked elegant, but strangely warm. The soft sound of music floated down, mixed with the earthy scent of the newly trimmed bushes, and the metallic taste of the impending rain. She hesitated, brushing the intricate carvings on the large double doors with her fingers. Before you could knock, the butler opened them. He had an expressionless face and eyes that were too dark and still. "Welcome," he muttered in a voice that sounded like the creaking of old floorboards. The air inside was heavy, the scent of expensive cologne and the faint tartness of champagne. The chatter of impeccably dressed guests floats on the waves. Instead, it felt distant and muffled. The house seemed to absorb the sound. Greg came in like a storm. The room fell silent. Synchronized breathing. He is not just a man, he is a force. A shadow wrapped in decoration. His movements were precise and calculated. It was as if he not only commanded attention, but also the air. Miranda's eyes locked on him. For more than a year, she had been obsessed with the story of this mysterious figure. A charming man spoken of only in whispers. It is said that his appearance removes all pretense. Tonight, she dressed carefully. Her scent, a mixture of jasmine and something darker, hangs in the air as she continues walking. Greg looked at her immediately. His smile was sharp. His eyes were colder than a glass of champagne. "Wait," he said in a low, almost hypnotic voice. "I have," Miranda said, her heart pounding in her ears. He leaned in closer. The musky scent of his cologne wrapped around her like a spider's web. "Come on," he whispered, sending her up the grand staircase. The party buzzed behind her as Miranda followed Greg down a hallway, bathed in sparkling candlelight. The air here is cooler, humid, and there are faint traces of something acidic, like wet, decaying rocks. "This house," Greg started to say. His voice echoed off the marble walls. "Alive!" Miranda laughed nervously. But Greg suddenly stopped. His hand rested on the plain wooden door, making it lighter. "Do you want to see it?" he asked. She couldn't answer. Shadows were damp as the corners of the room followed his eyes. Miranda fell to the ground. Her limbs were incredibly long and thin when looking at her. Miranda felt her legs go weak. "Run!" Greg whispered to her without having to tell her twice. Her heels clicked against the fleeing marble, and she could hear the movement of the shadows behind her. The nauseatingly scrapped main building was a blurred face, like a nail being dragged across the rock. And no one was aware of her panic. The jokes and music seemed twisted and distorted. Greg reappears. By blocking her path, his hands tightened on her shoulders. "Cool and steady, it found you," he said simply. "Is there something for me?" she breathed, dry and raw. "Home," Greg replied, his smile slashed cruelly. "Now it has chosen you," she pushed past him. A large door appeared in front of her. The cold night air hit her face as she staggered down the driveway. Her breath was ragged and shallow. The city lights below provided no comfort. There was only endless stretches of solitude. Miranda closed the door safely in her apartment and fell to the ground, hands shaking, but safety was only an illusion. The smell came first, a faint copper scent. Then, a soft but firm whisper hit her ears like deer's fibers. She tried to forget, but the dream wouldn't let her. They were filled with screaming shadows and crying masks. She burned the sage, lit a candle, and ran into the apartment. No one helped him. One morning she woke up and found a mask on the bedside table. A week later, she was standing in front of the building again. The invitation card crumpled in her hand. "You have to go back. You should know by now." The house became quieter and more empty. The air is still dense and oppressive. Greg found her almost immediately. This time his smile was wider and more knowing. "You're back," he said. "I need answers," Miranda said. He motioned for her to follow him. This time she didn't hesitate. "The mask room hasn't changed, but there is a shadow waiting." Her head tilted in recognition. "You're ready," Greg said. "Why?" Miranda asked, her voice trembling. "The house doesn't just pick anyone," he said. "Need some of the special." A shadow rushed towards her, and Miranda realized too late that she wasn't going to leave this time. Several months later, at the base of the building's grand staircase, a new guest stood with an invitation. The servant opened the door. Inside, there was the faint sound of music mixed with the smell of decay floating around. And Miranda was on the stairs. She smiled sharply. Her eyes were cold. "The house has chosen you. Now she has chosen a house."